Today we consider the second part of our lecture on philosophy of mind, which will be devoted to the 4 points, 4 issues. The first issue is why the mind-body problem is not go away, why it is still a very urgent problem. The second point is on subjectivity. What is subjectivity and why it is so hard, so difficult to explain it? The third point is concerning the Thomas Nagel's article, famous article, What is Like to be a Bat? And the fourth point is we will consider major issues of disagreement in theories of consciousness. 3 main points. So let's start. Why the mind-body problem will not go away? An amazing number of different philosophical theories have been put forward to solve the problem of consciousness. Yet, so far, none of the proposed solutions has been entirely successful. The problem remains with us, and now philosophers have tried to identify its core. Why exactly is the problem so frustratingly difficult? Is there something special about consciousness that sets it apart from everything else that science obviously can handle? As we know, nowadays the hard core of the mind-body problem is discussed under the labels the explanatory gap, the term was coined by Levine, and the heart problem, the term was coined by David Chalmers. The heart problem is, in its most general form, the problem that we do not have the slightest idea how any physical system could ever produce or give rise to any subjective qualitative experiences. In particular, we are totally in the dark about how neurons, neural activities, or anything physical going on in the brain could do the trick. The explanatory gap illustrates further why the heart problem is so hard, why the explanation of consciousness is not going to happen in the same way as the typical explanation of physical things usually happens. The explanation of how hydrogen and oxygen molecules, when put together, in a particular manner, necessarily produce water molecules is intelligible. The explanation for why water is liquid when the temperature is between 0 and 100 degrees is transparent. In this condition, the molecules can freely roll over each other, whereas in lower temperatures they cannot, and water becomes ice. There are no incomprehensible mysteries here, but phenomenal experiences in our subjective psychological reality seem to be utterly different from the physical or neural properties in the objective biological reality of the brain. To count as a genuine explanation the connection between subjective experience and objective brain activity should be made equally transparent and intelligible as the explanation of liquidity in terms of the behavior of water molecules. But how could any imaginable combination of neural activities add up to phenomenal experiences with a law-like necessity that would be plain for us to see and understand? An explanation of subjective conscious phenomena in terms of objective biological phenomena just does not seem to work, because any imaginable connection between a particular subjective experience and a particular neuronal activity seems wholly arbitrary and non-explanatory. How or why should this particular neural activity give rise to just this particular quality of experience. Even if we find out that neural activity of type Z invariably gives rise to phenomenal experience of type Q, and even it would be an unshakable law of nature that Z consequently Q, we would still not understand why the connection between Z and Q exists, or what it is based on, or how it works. We would only know that such a connection exists. The arrow from Z to Q could equally well read, and here a miracle happens. And an attempt at an explanation of the connection between the physical and the phenomenal realms falls headlong into a bottomless chasm, the unbridgeable explanatory gap. Our second issue today is subjectivity. Properties that can be described and explained can be observed publicly and objectively. Given the proper technical equipment, basically anyone can make an observation or a measurement concerning, say, the firing of neurons in the brain. The fact that there are neurons firing in the brain and that they are firing at a certain rate or frequency is an objective fact. The neural phenomenon exists independently of whether we observe it or not, and its existence can be confirmed or disconfirmed through measurements and observations in many different ways by different people independently of each other. This constitutes the status of neural firing as an objective fact about the world. Phenomenal consciousness is different. The fact that you will feel euphoric, or there is a pain in your tooth, or you are having a vivid dream experience, or flying through the air, is subjective. No one apart from yourself can observe or have those experiences, nor can anyone else absolutely confirm or disconfirm this existence or know their experiential quality as you do. Even if we scan your brain activity with the latest brain scanning technology, we will at best only see patterns of neural or metabolic activity in the brain. Through objective measurements, we will not see anything even remotely resembling your experiences. The experiences exist only for a single person, you, from your first person's perspective, in your subjective psychological reality. The problem is that science built exclusively on a third person subjective perspective only entitle entities that can be somehow studied from the perspective from that perspective are treated as real. Physical entities can be absorbed by anyone either directly with sense organs or indirectly through their effects on research instruments. They have causal powers and they fulfill specific causal roles in the physical world. And they consist of other physical properties or entities, so that large-scale entities can be decomposed to micro-level entities. Phenomenal consciousness does not seem to obey these principles. It cannot be observed either directly or with the help of any research instruments such as functional brain imaging, at least not with any currently available research instruments. Phenomenal features or the qualities of experience do not seem to be analyzable into causal or functional roles, which is exactly why functionalism never got a grip of consciousness. And the qualitative features of experience, such as whiteness, painfulness, sweetness, softness, happiness, do not seem to be composed of lower-level microscopic physical entities, such as neurons or molecules. Thus, it seems impossible to have a theory of the brain from which an explanation of consciousness would follow in a natural manner, for the brain can be fully described in objective physical, chemical, and biological terms, just like any other purely physical system. But such a description in no way leads to or includes an explanation of the qualitative, subjective features of consciousness. Even worse is to come. Not only is the objective approach unable to explain consciousness, but it seems unable to acknowledge its very existence. If we stick firmly to the third person's physicalist point of view on the world, the qualities of phenomenal experience seem to vanish altogether. The colors we experience, blueness, greenness, redness, yellowness, whiteness, blackness, as subjective qualities, are now here to be found in the physical world. They are not properties of electromagnetic radiation in the so-called visible wavelengths. The radiation consists of photons in different wavelengths of energy, not of photons painted with different experiential colors. In the electromagnetic energy to which our eyes are sensitive, so-called visible light, there is nothing even remotely resembling our experience of colors as far as our physical theories or electromagnetism can tell. The same goes for other qualities of experience. In sodium chloride, or common salt, there is nothing constituting the salty quality that we taste in our phenomenal consciousness. Chemically, sodium chloride is just a simple molecule. It contains no tastes hidden inside. If the qualities of experience are not in the physical stimuli out there, perhaps they can be found in the brain activities inside us. Certainly, tasting sodium chloride or seeing a color does correlate with specific changes in brain activity. But to measure or describe the neural changes does not equate to finding out about the salty quality of the experience. Some specific neurons in the brain can be described as firing in a specific way when we taste salt or when we experience blueness in our visual field. But as far as neuroscience can tell, there is nothing qualitatively blue or salty in the neural activities. We simply have no idea how the qualities of experience come about or why they correlate with specific neural activities rather than others. It is the explanatory gap all over again. Subjectivity simply does not seem to fit into the objective world of science. The third part of our lection is devoted to the famous article of Thomas Nagel, which title is What It Is Like to Be a Bat. In his article, Thomas Nagel in 1974 posed the above question by using animal consciousness, or in general alien consciousness, as his example. More specifically, he put forward the most famous question in modern consciousness studies: what it is like to be a bat. What is life like for a bat as a subjective conscious being? Will science ever be able to tell us? He first pointed out that none of the available and popular theories of mind, for example, reductionism, behaviorism, or functionalism, could even begin to answer this question. They simply ignore the whole question. Thus, it seems that although science will one day be able to give a full description of bad behavior, anatomy, physiology, and neuroscience, and cognitive information processing in the bad brain, we still would have no idea of what is it like to be a bat. To figure that out, a third-person approach is insufficient. Thus, Nagel asked if there might be any way around this problem so that we could reach the subjective point of view of the bat. He tried out three alternatives as thought experiments: imitation, shared experiences, and gradual transformation. Imitation. What if I followed closely the life of bats in their natural habitat and started to imitate a bat way of life? I would hang upside down in the attic during the day and hunt for flying insects for food with an echolocation radar system during the night. Unfortunately, that kind of adventurous field research would not get us very far. I would only find out what is a miserably poor imitation of bad behavior would feel like for a human being, probably extremely awkward and unnatural. Not what it feels like for the bat to be a bat, presumably perfectly simple and natural. The second alternative: shared experiences between humans and bats. Both species can feel pain, hunger, thirst, cold, warm, and so on. But this would not work either. This would not work either. Surely the bat's psychological reality is as rich as the human's, although the two realities are qualitatively very different, and of course the bat's reality mostly focuses on representation of rather different things in the world than the human conscious mind does. The bat's conscious mind probably represents other fellow bats in the colony, the best flight routes to food and mates, the typical shapes and flight patterns of edible flying insects, and mortal threats for bats from larger deadly predators. Thus, only concentrating on the experiences of pain, hunger, thirst, cold, and warmth would leave out most things of the bat's world, just as it leaves out most of the human subjective world. If aliens from another planet came to Earth and modeled our consciousness by only taking into account those kinds of experience, we would protest that they still have no idea of what it is like to be a conscious human being. The bat would protest similarly against us if it could. And the third alternative is gradual transformation by using some future technology, for example, into a bat and then back into a human. Apart from the sobering fact that such a transformation is technically beyond our wildest dreams, even if we had it at hand, it probably would not solve the problem of knowing what it is like to be a bat. Before becoming the bat, the foolhardily conscious scientist would not yet know what it is like. While being the bat, Our heroic explorer would know, but unfortunately would also be constitutionally incapable of communicating that knowledge to anyone. The bat, the scientist has now become, would not remember that it was supposed to gather and later communicate scientific data about bat consciousness, or even have any idea that the whole experience is, in fact, a scientific experiment. We would just as well try to interview any ordinary bat right now with results as meager as with the transformed bat. And when the backward transformation is completed, our explorer very likely would be unable to recall or verbally describe what it was like to be a bat. We have all been fetuses, experienced our own birth, and spent months in a cradle as babies. Yet we have no idea anymore what it was like to be a fetus and newborn or an infant. What was our conscious experience like? Was it clear? Was it clear and distinct, or blurred and chaotic? How did we perceive our own teeny body? How did we feel about our parents? Did we have any idea what was going on? We just do not know. And the transformation from a human fetus or baby to an adult human is significantly less radical than the imagined transformation from a human being to a bat. So, what conclusions can we do? Nagel ends up with a pessimistic conclusion that science will probably never find out what it is like to be a bat. Such knowledge is beyond all imaginable research instruments or measurements, and even if it was not, it would still remain beyond human language and concepts, and therefore, in principle, be indescribable by any human science. In agreement with Nagel, many current philosophers hold that the problem of consciousness will remain with us forever. Even if neuroscience and cognitive science make progress in other ways, even a perfect cognitive neuroscience would not be able to tell us what it is like to be a bat or why and how neuronal activity brings about conscious experiences. Then again, at least some philosophers and many neuroscientists are more optimistic about the prospects for a true explanatory science of consciousness. They point out that scientific progress is impossible to predict and that future breakthroughs are impossible to foresee before their time comes. Therefore, what philosophers can and cannot imagine today will have no consequences whatsoever to the future of science. The history of science shows that before major scientific breakthroughs were actually made, say relativity theory, quantum mechanics, or DNA and genetics, philosophers and scientists were utterly unable to imagine them. Whether consciousness can be explained or not, the sciences of the distant future will in any case be like unimaginable science fiction for us, just like 21st century genetics and molecular biology would have seemed like magic for any 19th century biologist. And the last part of our lecture is devoted to the major issues of disagreement in theories of consciousness. There are three major issues that divide the theories of consciousness. The first is the location of consciousness. We have two positions, externalism and internalism. The second issue is the fundamental nature of consciousness. And here we have two positions also, phenomenology and cognition. And the third issue, the fundamental form of phenomenal consciousness. And we have here also two positions, atomism and holism. These issues have to do with the fundamental background assumptions adopted in the theories, the philosophical, metaphysical views of what consciousness is and what its place in nature is supposed to be. Let's consider the first, the location of consciousness, externalism and internalism. There is consciousness to be found. Where is consciousness to be found? The empirical theories we have looked at are committed to internalism. According to these theories, consciousness and qualia are features of brain activity and therefore literally located within the brain. Thus, when we have visual experiences, we are directly in touch with a neural reality inside the brain, an internal simulation of the world, although it looks to us as if we would see the outside world and its physical objects directly. The key to finding out where the conscious reality is in the brain is to explore the neural correlates and mechanisms of consciousness in the brain through neuroscientific methods. The opposite view is externalism. According to some of the philosophical theories, in particular the sensory motor theory and the representationalist theory, consciousness does not derive from brain activity at all, and consequently, the contents of consciousness cannot be located in the brain. Thus, the search for the neural correlates of consciousness is a misguided research program. These ideas follow from philosophical externalism, the view that mind and consciousness, and especially their mental experiential contents, are not contained in the head or the brain, but are in some sense in the world outside the head. When we open our eyes, we see the real world out there, not the insides of our brain. The mainstream empirical theories in cognitive neuroscience all seem to accept internalism, at least implicitly, and therefore, in cognitive neuroscience, the search for the neural correlates of consciousness is believed to be an important step toward an explanation of consciousness. The second issue, the fundamental nature of consciousness. And here we have two positions, phenomenology and cognition. What is the relationship between consciousness and cognitive functions? Is consciousness something independent of cognition, especially of higher cognitive functions such as attention, thinking, working memory, voluntary action, verbal reporting, or is it dependent on them or perhaps identical to them? Some theories view consciousness as a pure phenomenology, pure experiential subjective qualia that is independent of cognitive functions. For these theories, the fundamental form of consciousness is pure phenomenal consciousness. It exists in the form of qualitative subjectivity that emerges out of a special type of neural activity in brain regions that have no necessary connection to higher cognition. Thus, phenomenality merges also in states and in creatures that lack higher cognitive functions and verbal reportability. The criterion of phenomenality is the underlying neural mechanism or activity, such as recurrent processing, that integrates information. Other theories view consciousness as a cognitive function, or at least as necessarily dependent on such functions. For them, the fundamental form of consciousness is reflective consciousness or excess consciousness, which can be defined by its functional rather than phenomenal features. For these theories, the criterion of consciousness is access to output mechanisms and verbal reportability. The neural mechanism of consciousness is some sort of global workspace with wide cognitive and behavioral access. Information becomes conscious or enters the workspace only through top-down frontoparietal attentional selection or by higher order thought shining on lower order posterior sensory states. This disagreement is currently the most serious dividing line that separates different theories of consciousness from each other and also colors the interpretation of empirical results of the neural correlates of consciousness. Thus, whether a neural phenomenon that had been detected to correlate with conscious perception will be interpreted as a correlate of the actual subjective experience involved in perception depends largely on who interprets the results and on what background theory of consciousness it is based. For one theorist, an activity pattern in the early visual cortex is interpreted as a sign of visual phenomenal consciousness going on, whereas for another theorist, it is at most a non-conscious or preconscious visual processing that happens in the dark until touched by higher cognition. Without an objective consciousness detector, this basically philosophical disagreement seems impossible to resolve through any conventional behavioral tests or neurophysiological measurements. And the last point of disagreement is the fundamental form of phenomenal consciousness. And here we have also two positions, atomism and holism. In the history of consciousness studies, this battle was fought between structuralism and Gestalt psychology. Now similar positions have been adopted by modern theorists. The microconsciousness theory by Zeki represents an atomistic view in the spirit of structuralism. Consciousness is basically a collection of simple qualia, each one brought about independently of and in isolation from each other in the brain, and only later bound together to unified percepts. The opposite pole is represented most clearly by the unified field theory, for example, John Searle, the dynamic core theory, for example, Zanoni and Edelman, the information integration theory by Zanoni, and Damasio's theory of consciousness. They all suggest that consciousness is basically a unified, holistic phenomenon. Individual qualia are mere modulations of the unified field, ripples on the surface of a global, integrated experiential sphere. Unity and integration are necessary prerequisites for consciousness. Nothing phenomenally subjective can exist all by itself outside the unified field. Choosing one of these positions will also have crucial consequences in the search for the neural mechanisms of consciousness in the brain. Are we looking for multiple microconsciousness distributed all over the cortex, or a single unified bioelectrical sphere within the thalamocortical networks. Thank you for your attention.